Welcome to Preaching and Teaching the Old Testament. Today I'm going to focus on Proverbs. I'm going to focus on three different kinds of Proverbs that we can build sermons on or Bible studies on. And the first one is going to be one of the admonitions in the first 9 chapters. That is one of the literary forms, an admonition. And we're going to look at the 8th admonition. The other literary form is the wisdom sentence. This is what we're more familiar with in Proverbs. And if you remember from the factual data sheets, there's 2 different kinds of wisdom sentences. There's the general guideline, such as in Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. And then there is the unconditional promise kind of wisdom sentence, like in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not into your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. That's a promise. We're going to look at those 3 different kinds, and we're going to begin with this admonition. This is one of the 15 admonitions from chapters 1 to 9. This is the 8th. There are 3 admonitions in reference to the adulteress in Proverbs, and this would be one of those 3. And in a sermon or Bible study, as we're going to see, you need an attention step, something to get your listeners' attention in regard to your subject. And so I present this real case of a man who left his wife for her best friend and then spoke of the great regrets that he had. That would be your attention step, your interest step. Your attention step gets their attention in regard to the main point of the sermon, and the interest creates an interest in them. Sometimes with one illustration you can accomplish both. And then in the introduction also you need the introduce the subject step, which is puts your passage in the context of the book. I do that right here when Solomon is basically in Proverbs presenting 2 roads or lifestyles to travel, the road of the wise, the road of the fool. And on these 2 roads or paths, sometimes it's referred to as path or way, you have accompanying traveling companions. Such as on the road of the wise, you have the good wife, who is the traveling companion. That's in Proverbs 31. You would also have other traveling companions, such as the hard worker, or the one who uses his words wisely. But on the road of the fool, you have contrasting traveling companions to the virtuous woman in Proverbs 31. We're going to look at the adulteress. But also on the road of the wise, or the road of the fool, you would have the gossiper. Instead of the one who uses his words wisely, you would have the gossiper, the flatterer. Instead of the hard worker, you would have the sloth, the sluggard. And instead of the virtuous woman, you have the adulteress. That helps to introduce the subject step or the context of the book, and then we can narrow that down to Solomon's admonitions in regard to the adulterous woman. He gives a general admonition in chapter 2, 16 and 19, and then he gives these more lengthy, 3 lengthy admonitions in regard to the adulteress. That's a lot of material. 3 out of the 15 pertain to the adulteress, whom we are calling the home wrecker. Once you do your introduction, attention step, interest step, introduce the subject step, then then that leads you to the main point of the sermon. And for this one, we could put, we must avoid the home wrecker or the adulteress. That's followed by an interrogative. In this case, I've chosen how. How can we avoid the home wrecker? And then that's followed by the transitional sentence, which transitions from the interrogative to the first main division. Here's my transition. Solomon provided 4 insights that will aid in avoiding the adulteress. And then that gives us the main division. And under the main division, you're going to have an explanation. You're going to have argumentation, which is systematic theology or references, if you want to refer to it that way, that support your explanation. Then you would have application and then illustration and then your next main division. I'm not going to outline the whole sermon like this. I just wanted to show you the main parts of the sermon, and this will be like the template that you will be following. So we're in Proverbs 5, verses 1 and 2. What is the first insight from Solomon to avoid the adulteress or the home wrecker? Live by God's wisdom. Chapter 5, verse 1, my son. Here, these are the my son admonitions in chapters 1 to 9. This is the 8th. Chapter 5, verse 1, my son, attend unto my wisdom and bow your ear to my understanding, that you may regard discretion and that your lips may keep knowledge. That helps us identify a new main division with this my son. And then we can add the argumentation, which is another cross-reference. And it's interesting, in chapter 5, verse 1, Solomon said, attend unto my wisdom. And that would be in contrast to God's wisdom. But in Proverbs, what is Solomon communicating? He is communicating God's wisdom, because Solomon, in this cross-reference here, 1 Kings 4, 29 to 34, he is the wisest of all men, and there he refers to the many proverbs that he wrote. Here's some application. Mom and Dad, you have a great promise in James 1:5. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. That would be followed by an illustration. Here's an illustration of a father. I'm just going to refer to it. You will read this. Here's a father baffled by his son who's having a temper tantrum in the grocery store. He bows his head in frustration. What can I do? And God gives him a solution, impresses on his heart what to do. That leads us to the next main division. Avoid the adulteress. Look in verse 3. For the lips of a foreign woman. You see that for? That introduces reasons. So he gives the admonition in the first main division. He says, live by God's wisdom. And now he's going to give reasons. So this helps us know this is a new main division. He's going to give 2 reasons. The first reason is in verses 3 to 6. Because of her destruction, verse 3, for the lips of a foreign woman. And foreign this is not just Solomon saying avoid marrying foreign women. No, these foreign women, as we know from Solomon's case later on, were unbelievers who worshipped other gods, and Solomon began to follow the other gods of these foreign women. And so that's why she is referred to like that. For the lips of a foreign woman drop as an honeycomb. he's going to talk about her destruction, her end in verse 4, but her end is bitter. But before he gets there, he talks about how powerful are her words. They drop as a honeycomb. This is a reference to the first honey that drips from a broken honeycomb, and it was referred to as virgin honey. Ironically, the virgin honey that is dripping from this woman's mouth is from someone who is not a virgin, who is trying to rob young men of their virginity. And then I can use this as a cross-reference, Proverbs 7. Just you turn the page and you come to the third admonition against the adulteress. And in these verses, like verses 10 and following, it's like Solomon gives an eyewitness report of the adulteress at work. She's standing on the street corner, and she lures in this young simpleton who is foolish. And Solomon issues this warning that this road in her life, this path, this lifestyle that she lives, is a destructive life. We go back to Proverbs 5 and verse 5 and verse 4. But her end is as bitter as wormwood. Her words are like honey, but the end of her influence is bitter. Verse 5 says, her feet go down to death, and her steps take hold on hell. He says, avoid the adulteress, number one, because of her destruction. And then number two, the second reason is because of the destruction she brings to those who fall prey to her. In verse 7, how do we know this is like a new subdivision? Look in verse 7. Hear me now, therefore, O you children. It's like, O my son. So these are like little markers that help us to see when Solomon is changing his argument. And what he's going to do here is give us the consequences of those who would fall prey to her. Verse 7, hear me now, therefore, O you children, depart not from the words of my mouth. Don't listen to the words of her mouth. Listen to the words of wisdom from my mouth. Verse 8, remove your way far from her and come not nigh to the door of her house, lest you give your honor unto others and your years unto the cruel. Now he's going to list the devastating consequences. Verse 9, you lose your honor. Verse 10, you lose your wealth. And I give a few applications and examples of this. You lose your honor like David, the man after God's own heart. You lose your wealth in a number of ways. You lose your health. And I give examples here from Old Testament scholar Bruce Waltke and from J. Vernon McGee. Then you lose your mental peace in verse 12. Look in verse 12. And say. Again, he's helping us to see he's transitioning to another consequence here. And say, this is dialogue. How have I hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof? This instruction goes all the way down through verse 15, through verse 14. And then we see the next advice from Solomon, which is positive, beginning in verse 15. Drink waters out of your own cistern. Because this is positive and not negative, as Solomon has been doing, a new main division. That's what we look for here. Content changes, dialogue, etc. that help us know that Solomon now is pursuing his main objective here to give advice. But this is new advice. This is positive, as he says in verse 18. rejoice with the wife of your youth. And so I just asked this question that logically would come up. How can Solomon say, rejoice with the wife of your youth, when he had 1,000? He had 700 wives, 300 concubines. How can he admonish here when he did not practice what he preached? So I give the 3 books that Solomon wrote in their most likely order that he wrote them. The first book he wrote was Song of Solomon to the wife that he chose. That's a Shulamite woman. This is a love song. When Solomon became king, he inherited a harem, and Solomon refers to that harem in Song of Solomon 6:8. 140 wives and concubines, but to the Shulamite woman he said, you are the only one. This is in 6:9. The only one of her mother. At this point, he is a one-woman man. That's his first book. He writes Proverbs when he's a little older, a little wiser, and in that wisdom, this is where he is giving this admonition to his son. I mentioned the biography of Solomon in 1 Kings 3 through 1 Kings 11, and you see how he progressively moves away from the Lord. There's an interesting intention here. We call them bookends, where in 1 Kings 3:3, the biographer says Solomon loved the Lord. At the end of his 40-year reign, in 1 Kings 11:1, the author says Solomon loved many foreign women. What's he doing? He is giving us a deliberate contrast of how Solomon departed from the Lord, and he departed from the wife of his youth. And then the last book that Solomon wrote was Ecclesiastes, when he's elderly, some believe right before he dies, but after he repents of those many years of departing from the Lord. And now he's admonishing a new cohort of leaders that was like him at one point, wealthy, a lot of potential for leadership. He warns them, don't follow the path I chose. And then the last advice is in the end of the chapter, verses 20 to 23, where he says, embrace wisdom. So he circles back. Look in verse 20. And why will you, my son, be ravished with the foreign woman? We have another my son that helps us see a new main division. And so he's going to admonish his son in verse 20 not to embrace the adulteress. We could go back to 4:8 where he uses that word, embrace wisdom. And then he just gives warnings in verses 21 to 23. But is there any hope? Yes, there is. We can look at Solomon's dad. We know David sinned. And after 9 months of being unrepentant and silent, he finally repented of his adultery with Bathsheba. And in Psalm 32, 1 and 2, he wrote, blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, in whose spirit is no deceit. I preached a similar message just like this. Of course, I used all the illustrations and was more detailed. Preached it on Sunday morning. The next day, two of our lady members came to the parsonage. My wife was there. And one of the women brought her best friend, and she said to me, I am guilty of the sin of Solomon, that's the sin Solomon was warning against. Very just incredible confession. And she left her job where her liaison was. That was many years ago. And God has blessed her confession and her marriage. These are pretty tough admonitions to preach and teach. If you're going through the 15 admonitions in Proverbs 1 to 9, you're going to be dealing with this 3 times in depth. That's sort of hard plowing. But I think you can see there can be great results. This is one of the admonitions. We're going to look next at wisdom sentences.